Davy, if you don't water these plants soon, they will go and die right on top of you. That was Kevin Morris telling me what I already knew. Everything my sister planted last spring has wilted from neglect. I guess I just didn't care enough to water them. She probably spent a small fortune on those roses under the windows, not to mention the time she spent planting them in the flower boxes my ex-wife and I had constructed. My sister Jane thought roses might lift my spirits and lift me out of my depression. That's not going to happen. Let those damn flowers die just like my wife's love for me. Dead, just like my good friend Stuart Olson. We just buried Stuart today. Kevin and I gave the eulogy. There wasn't a dry eye in the chapel after Kevin finished his 10-minute eulogy. Then it was my turn. We planned it this way. Kevin brought them to tears. Then I did my best to lighten the mood by telling a couple stories from our time in the group. Kevin, Stuart, and I composed The Yonder Blues Road. We were doing pretty well regionally. We were busy most weekends and enough weekdays to attract a lot of fans. It was there that I met Sandy, a gorgeous blonde snapper who became my wife. It was at that moment that it hit me. Today was exactly the year I saw that awful look on her face and heard her version of, "We need to talk." Could this really have happened today? The 1-year anniversary of the dissolution of my marriage and my best friend's funeral on the same day? It all flashed through my head in a matter of seconds as I unscrewed the caps off 2 bottles of beer. Kevin pulled a Jack Daniels off the shelf and poured 2 shots. Kevin raised his glass. Salud. Salute, I replied to his toast in honor of our friend who was half Swedish, half Italian, and a long-suffering Vikings fan. We each had a shot of Jack and started on our beers. "Hey, Davy, your hand is bleeding." I looked down, and sure enough, I must have cut my finger when I was unscrewing the beer bottle caps. I grabbed a towel from the bar and wrapped it around the wound before going into the bathroom where I keep the first aid kit. As I unwrapped the towel, I noticed the embroidery. "Davy and Sandy, August 3rd, 2005. May you always love each other as much as you did on your wedding day." Her grandmother sewed and gave us a set of this jewelry as a wedding gift. I guess Sandy didn't bother to take them with the rest of the stuff she pulled out of here last year. Kevin noticed the look on my face when I came back from the bath. "I was going to go home, but would you like me to stay? Shall we have another drink?" "No, buddy. Go home to your wife. These are always tough days for spouses. Give Patty a hug for me and give her my love." With those words, Kevin walked away, leaving me to ponder how everything in my life had turned to shit. The Yonder Blues Road played at a small tavern in Madison. We had a packed crowd that night. A lot of covers blended perfectly with some of our original tunes, good old blues and rock. Stuart on drums, Kevin on bass and keyboards, and I sang and played guitar. A beautiful Les Paul signed by the man himself. It was supposed to hang on the wall in my office, but Mr. Paul himself told me it would be a shame not to play such a beautiful instrument, which I did. Speaking of beauty, there, in the crowd, was the same blonde girl who was here 6 weeks ago when we last performed in this bar. You couldn't, at least I couldn't, miss her. She was about 170 centimeters tall, with long blonde hair, a cute smile, and a stunning body covered in a tight tank top and skinny jeans. Anyway, that night I did something we only did on very rare occasions, and only when there was a lady in the audience with the right physique and dance moves. Remember the Bruce Springsteen Dancing in the Dark video where Bruce invites a random girl, who just happens to be Courtney Cox before she became famous in Friends, on stage to dance? Well, that's what I did with the blonde girl when we performed a cover of a Springsteen song, and she did it. She danced, we played, and the crowd went crazy. She was still at the bar when the band finished their second and final encore. You don't have to hit me over the head with a brick to realize that this lady was waiting for me. Kevin and Stuart gave me a break from disassembling my gear, no roadies in the small business rock scene, while I headed to the bar to introduce myself. We chatted for a few minutes before she gave me her phone number, asking me to call. Then, she walked out, and I stared at her perfect ass in those jeans. Weeks later, the band had another gig scheduled at a club in Madison. I called Sandy and asked if she was available for a real date on Friday since we were playing on Saturday. She said yes, and I made reservations at a top restaurant and bought tickets for the University Symphony Orchestra. I picked Sandy up at her house, and she looked just gorgeous in her little black dress and heels. Nothing slutty, just classy. I was glad I was wearing a nice sports jacket and had shaved the usual stubble off my face. Our conversation over dinner was easy. We were just getting to know each other, our likes and dislikes. Sandy held my hand during the concert. She told me I had made the right choice. Beethoven was her favorite composer, and the Third Symphony was one of the two of his she liked best. She said she was surprised that a blues rock guitarist chose the symphony. I had to confess that as a youngster I took violin lessons for 8 years and 4 years in our high school chamber orchestra. I also confessed that I picked up the guitar because, when I was a horny teenager, girls liked guitarists more than concert violinists. Sandy laughed heartily at this. After the concert, I took Sandy to a quiet lounge for a drink and then went back to her house. As we stood in the doorway, I told her how much I enjoyed her company and asked if she would be at the tavern on Saturday. "Will you be at the club tomorrow night, or can we have a cup of coffee after I'm done?" "Sorry, Davy. I'm not going to lie to you. I have plans tomorrow night, and it wouldn't be fair to him to cancel so late. I just had a great night with you, but justice is justice. I hope we can do it again soon." I was disappointed. It was one of the best evenings I've had in a long time. I thought we really hit it off. But I held my tongue, not wanting to ruin an enjoyable evening with too harsh a statement. I gave her a quick kiss and left. The next night, I tried my best not to let the disappointment affect our show, but I know it lacked energy because no one really cared when the last set ended without an encore and we left the stage by 11. After loading my gear into the truck, I hit the road to get rid of my fear. That turned out to be a bad idea because as I was leaving the local coffee shop with a cup of coffee, I saw Sandy and some guy coming out of a jazz club across the street. The guy looked very familiar, probably an athlete, considering his height and build. They seemed very close, just enough so that Sandy didn't notice me. I sat at one of the tables on the sidewalk and watched them walk down the block. There was no way I would have stooped to follow them, but there was no need, as they only walked half a block before entering a nice apartment building. I sat there finishing my coffee and feeling sorry for myself before walking down to that building and looking at the list of names next to the call buttons. A name caught my eye. B. Johnston. That's why he seemed familiar to me. Benjamin, or more commonly known as Benny Johnston, was an All-American running back who was drafted by the New York Jets right out of his senior year at Wisconsin. It was a pretty upscale building in the business district for a college student. Either some rich alumni were providing Benny with comfort, or he had already started spending his multi-million-dollar signing bonus. I didn't stick around to see if Sandy had stayed the night. I did what any self-respecting guy would do. I found a bar that was open late, ordered a double shot of whiskey, picked up a girl who recognized rock star, and took her to my hotel room for a night of animal sex. The next morning, I got in my car and headed home with the intention of forgetting all about Sandy. I almost expected a call from Sandy within the next week and was somewhat surprised when I didn't get one. What I didn't know was that Sandy's younger sister, Alice, a 16-year-old wild child, had been found dead in a New York City subway that Sunday. An obvious overdose victim whose friends got scared and just left her there. I learned much later about this family tragedy. While Sandy dealt with her unfortunate family issues, I didn't notice anything, assuming that Sandy had a better deal with a wealthy professional athlete. I immersed myself in my work and the band. We started getting more bookings in the greater Chicagoland area, so we no longer made trips to Madison or western Wisconsin. Sandy became a distant memory. The memory reawakened again one night when our band was playing at a club on Belmont Avenue. I looked around the crowd and saw Sandy. Since she wasn't looking at me at that moment, I quickly averted my gaze. At the next opportunity, I told Kevin and Stuart that I was changing the playlist, and we started with Dancing in the Dark. But instead of asking Sandy to come up on stage, I noticed a blonde beauty in the audience and asked her to come up. I tried my best to flirt with the blonde while she tried her best to act sexy. She wasn't bad, but she wasn't Sandy. When the song ended, I looked around the crowd again. Sandy was nowhere to be seen. My petty act of retribution must have accomplished its goal, but for some reason I didn't get the enjoyment I had hoped for. I decided to take a chance. Her number was still in my phone's contact list. Monday morning, I texted, "Kevin said he noticed you on Saturday. Is there a reason you didn't say hello?" 10 minutes later came the reply. "You seemed busy. Didn't want to intrude. Are you in town? Can we get coffee?" I work in administration at Northwestern Memorial, and I have a flexible schedule, so you name it when. "Then how about lunch? Geno's at noon on the Superior?" "Yes!" That was the beginning of our relationship. We met for lunch, and Sandy told me why she had disappeared that week because of her sister's death. When she asked why I hadn't called, I made a lame excuse about being overworked that week and that since she hadn't called me, I figured she had better things to do. She never mentioned Benny Johnston, and neither did I. Probably because it would reflect badly on me. Was I stalking her? I knew I wasn't, but what would she think? It wasn't the best way to start a relationship. A few innocent lies and overtures on my part, a few things she left unsaid. Since lunch seemed to be a success, I invited her to the symphony orchestra on Thursday. Midori was to play Dvorak's concerto for violin and orchestra, and I had access to some great seats. Sandy said she would love to go, and from that evening we were a couple. Our physical relationship took a few weeks to consummate. It was after a Sunday afternoon shopping trip on Michigan Avenue. Sandy asked me if she could spare a half hour to herself and walked into Victoria's Secret. We ate a light dinner at her house, and then she disappeared into the bedroom. Sandy came out in a see-through blouse and thong panties, then led me by the hand back to her bedroom. The lights were dimmed, and there were a couple candles burning. Sandy began undressing me until I was naked. We did have more chances, both that weekend and in the days and nights that followed. Sandy and I discovered that we had quite a bit in common, besides great sex and music. We had a few issues, the main one being my time with the band. Between my job as a systems analyst and band rehearsals, playing at clubs on the weekends only increased the time spent away from each other. Plus, even though Sandy said she trusted me, the whole groupie thing was a problem. Despite these problems, we still managed to get engaged a few months after we became exclusive. I proposed one summer evening right after a great Siegel Schwall reunion concert in Grant Park. Sandy said yes between kisses. I booked a nice downtown room for the occasion. We celebrated our engagement in a room overlooking the lake, with the curtains open. We made love, and then sat in bed with her head resting on my chest. She looked at me with her beautiful blue eyes. "I love your touch." "That's good, because I have a firm intention to play with this body for the rest of my life. I was in heaven. At least until the Jets traveled to Chicago 6 weeks later to play the Bears in a preseason game. On the Thursday before the game, Sandy was very quiet while we were eating dinner. To make matters worse, she made up some excuse to meet for drinks with her co-workers on Friday night after work. Alarm bells rang in my head and light bulbs went off. Sandy arrived around 10 p.m. and was still very quiet. After she fell asleep, I found her panties and smelled them. I was glad that I didn't smell any odor or any female arousal. Maybe I didn't have anything to worry about after all, but I kept my senses keen for the rest of the weekend. I was even more pleased when I checked her email while she slept. There was a message from Benny begging her to see him again before he had to leave town with the team. Her reply read, it was over between them. She was engaged. She loved her fiancé and had agreed to meet him on Friday just to tell him to his face. She asked him to never contact her again. 3 weeks later, the event that changed my life happened. Yonder Blues Road was playing at a great dive bar in Kankakee when 5 or 6 members of a motorcycle gang from Joliet showed up. The band had just finished their second set when there was a commotion in the back of the bar. Most of the bar patrons were trying to figure out what was going on, but I was in a hurry to get a beer, so I stood with my back to the fight. Suddenly, I heard a distinctive clicking sound behind me. Before I could react, I heard another sound I couldn't identify and felt a sharp pain in my arm. Turns out the click was the sound of a switchblade opening. One of the bikers intended to stab me in the back, for what reason I couldn't imagine. The second sound I heard was Kevin's bass guitar hitting the biker in the back when he saw him coming at me with the knife. Kevin hit him hard enough that the knife missed its target. The cut on my arm wasn't serious, but deep enough that I needed 12 stitches in the emergency room. Needless to say, that was the final straw for Sandy. I had to quit the band or there would be no wedding. The biker never admitted why he was targeting me. He ended up getting 5 years in prison on a variety of charges related to the incident. The whole thing was weird. Something wasn't right, and it seemed like the whole episode was staged on purpose to get through to me, or was I being paranoid? Years later, I found out the truth. The band had a few shows that couldn't be canceled without significant monetary penalties, so we renamed those last 6 shows the Goodbye Yonder Blues Road Tour, and then I parted ways, anticipating a life with Sandy. Getting married, buying a house, renovating it, and making it our home. We had been enjoying marital bliss for over 2 years when things went south. Sandy felt stuck in her job and had very little hope for advancement over the next few years. She was in her late 30s and wanted to wait a few more years before having children. In the meantime, she hoped to have a rewarding career. Sandy had contacted every hospital in the area to no avail. She received a call from a job hunter with a great prospect. St. Jude Children's Hospital in Memphis was interested in talking to her. We discussed it at length. I could probably start looking for jobs in the Memphis area, but it might be a while before something opens up in my area. Will our marriage remain strong if we live apart for a few months or so? Other couples have done it, so why not us? Sandy ended up interviewing, got a favorable offer, and we unfortunately decided to live in different cities for a while. It might have worked if it hadn't been for one snag. 2 weeks after Sandy moved to Memphis, Benny Johnston was traded from the Jets to the Titans. Nashville and Memphis are 300 kilometers apart, otherwise I might have taken more initiative. Heck, I could have just quit my job and moved there. But I allowed the events that eventually led to the breakup of my marriage to happen because, while I thought 300 kilometers would be an obstacle to Benny Sandy's pursuit, he didn't think it was too far to travel. Something else happened during our time apart. I received an email from Sandy's college friend, Davy. I found out about this website from an old friend. At first I thought the girl in the video was young Sandy, but then I realized it must be her sister. I didn't know how to approach Sandy, so I'm asking for your help in removing this from the website. Jason. The email had a link to an adult website. I hesitated before finally taking a look. I had never met Alice, but I had seen the pictures. The young woman in the video was definitely Alice, and the first part of the video showed Alice with a woman in a sexual situation. I didn't watch the rest of it. I didn't want to, but I needed a family member with access to her birth certificate to contact the website to remove the underage Alice video. Sandy was shocked when I told her. She deleted the video, which spared her parents another unpleasant reminder of what their young daughter had become. Shortly thereafter, the relationship deteriorated. I assumed we would reconnect after we lived together again. I sent out more resumes to Memphis companies, hoping to get offers. When Benny found out from mutual friends that Sandy was living alone in Memphis, he started his campaign. I don't know all the details, just the end result. In the 3rd month of our separation, I flew to Memphis to interview for the company. Sandy met me at the airport, and it was obvious something was wrong. My interview went well, and I was offered the job. I took a cab to Sandy's apartment, and as I walked in, I heard these sad words. Davy, I'm sorry, honey. We need to talk. Part of my depression after the divorce was self-loathing for never being completely honest with Sandy. I never knew how to approach the subject of her relationship with Benny, a professional soccer superstar. I'm no slouch physically. I have a decent body. I'm 185 centimeters athletic, handsome enough to attract the ladies. But how can any guy compare to a 190 centimeters tall, 110-pound millionaire who is strong enough to play professional baseball? So I probably did the worst thing anyone else could have done by not discussing the elephant in the room, to realize what demons Sandy was dealing with regarding Benny, and to appease those demons by speaking out about it. A year later, I was stuck in my discouragement, letting the disintegration of my marriage continue to weigh on me. I didn't accept a job offer from a Memphis company and stayed here in Chicago. Sandy and I divorced, and she moved in with Benny. Stuart was hit by a drunk driver while riding his motorcycle home from work. The past year stretched too slowly. Why does time speed up when things are going so fantastically, but slow down during difficult days, months, years? It just doesn't seem fair. And one good thing did happen a month after Stuart's memorial service. Kevin was playing bass in a local hot blues band, the John Reginald Group. They were in the middle of recording when their guitarist was arrested for dealing drugs. Kevin told John I was available. John was familiar with my playing and called me to see if it was a good fit for me. As the story goes, I auditioned and took a leave of absence from work to help the band finish the CD. One day I got John comfortable with me when I suggested using an electric violin in one of the rooms. The next day I brought my violin into the studio, turned on my best dad John Creech and cranked the playback. The band and producer loved it and the track made it onto the CD. Perhaps it was the endorphins released that week in the studio, but suddenly things were looking a little brighter again. The new attitude probably had a lot to do with what happened next. My sister Jane threw a dinner party and introduced me to a woman from her work. Kate Morgan can only be characterized as a breath of fresh air. We sat next to each other during dinner. My sister is no fool. And I probably monopolized her time to the point where I was rude to the rest of Jane's guests. Turns out the others were just happy to see me in such a good mood for a change. It's nice to have great friends. I did my best to learn everything I could about this pretty brunette, beyond what was physically striking. Her brown eyes, bright smile, athletic build hidden under a conservative dress. She was 24 years old and a year out of graduate school with an MBA in finance. She had worked with my sister the previous year and appreciated the way my sister mentored her. Most importantly, she was not currently dating anyone. Before Kate left, I invited her to go out the following weekend. I must have done something right that night because she agreed to a date the following Saturday night. I won't bore the reader with all the details. I'll just say that one date led to a second, third, and many more. I introduced Kate to my family and she introduced me to her parents one weekend, 2 months after we started dating. Kate came from a small town in Indiana and her parents were pretty conservative Catholics. I went to church for Sunday Mass for the first time since graduating from high school. That weekend, I learned a lot about Kate, things she was too modest to talk about herself. Her parents were very proud of their only child and more than cared for her. You could see the pride when her mother and father talked about Kate graduating high school with a valedictorian speech, being prom queen and captain of the volleyball team. She received a full scholarship to Loyola and graduated from college as a greeter. Up to this point, Kate and I had limited ourselves to kissing and the occasional, very hot cuddle, but she wanted to take her time with the physical aspect of our relationship. She said she wouldn't engage in a sexual relationship with me until she realized that we loved each other and that it was more than a passionate infatuation. As hard as it was, I liked this woman enough to respect her wishes. On the way home from her parents' house, she spent 3 hours answering my questions and filling in the blanks. I learned that she had only had close relationships with 2 men. The last one she dated for 3 years during college. She knew she was different from most women of our generation, but she was comfortable with herself. She knew that many men stopped asking her out after a couple dates because she wouldn't give in to their demands, and that was one of the things she loved. Yes, she used the word love about me. That I respected her and didn't force her to be someone she wasn't. I told her that sometimes it was hard to give up the intimacy of the physical relationship I wanted us to share, but that I loved her, first time I used that word in front of her, and hoped that someday soon we could share more than kisses. For that, Kate kissed me firmly on the cheek as we raced down the freeway at 110 kilometers per hour. I truly believe we would have consummated our relationship that night if it weren't for the fact that Kate had a 6:30 flight the next morning, and she still needed to pack and get some rest. The last thing I wanted to do was rush the moment. I dropped Kate off at her apartment, gave her a big hug, and gave her a better kiss. It promised to be a long week until she got home on Friday. We agreed that I would pick her up at O'Hare on Friday and we would have dinner at our favorite restaurant. During that same week, it became impossible to ignore what was going on in my ex-wife's life. The sports page was filled with news of Benjamin Johnston being released from the Titans because he failed another drug test. Even worse for sweet old Benny, he was arrested that same night for domestic violence. Raging rage. The papers didn't name the victim, but Benny hit his cohabitant and he ended up in jail. I admit I feel sorry for Sandy. She may have been crap for leaving me for Benny, but I don't think anyone deserves to be physically abused by their spouse. My relationship with Kate was now so strong that by Friday I was barely thinking about Sandy's situation when I met Kate at the baggage carousel with a dozen red roses in her hand. Kate nearly knocked them out of my hands as she jumped into my arms and showered me with the most passionate kisses. I made reservations at Charlie's. Let's grab your bag and go into town. Kate surprised me with her answer. If we go out to dinner, these flowers might start to wilt. I have a better idea. Let's get a couple Italian steaks to go and eat at your place. I've missed you, and I want to be alone with you. We got the food and went to my house. We discussed our jobs. Kate's trip went well and may lead to a promotion in the near future. After food, drinks, and conversation, Kate got right down to business. Take me to bed, Davy. I want to make love to you tonight. We did make love. We took our time. When I undressed her, I couldn't help but smile. What's so funny? Kate looked hurt. It's not funny. I'm smiling like a fool because you have a beautiful body, and I've been dying to see it since that night at my sister's. Now that I can, I don't know whether to just look at it or just hold it. It's hard to do both at the same time. Make love to it, was her answer. We made love again and fell asleep wrapped up in each other under the covers. When Kate woke up the next morning, I was no longer asleep, just lay there looking at this beauty. Kate woke up and looked at me confused. This was the first time in my life that I had ever slept naked. It was great. What do you want to do today? I'm hoping we can spend the whole weekend together. Let's go to the park. I really need a run after a week of traveling. You'll probably run circles around me. We can run if you promise not to burn out like you usually do. There are other exercises I'd like to focus on tonight. It's a deal. I'm going to stop by the house to pick up my running gear and some clothes if we're going to spend the weekend here. Kate left shortly thereafter, declining my offer to give her a ride. She took a cab to her house and was due back in a couple hours. I spent the next hour doing the usual weekend household chores, wanting the house to look nice for Kate's return. An hour after she left, the doorbell rang. I was excited. Kate must have been so anxious to get back that she had cut the expected time in half. I opened the door and got a very unexpected surprise. Hi, Sandy. Hi, Davy, can I come in? I could only nod and step aside as Sandy, looking as beautiful as ever, walked through the door for the first time since she had packed up her personal belongings almost a year and a half ago. As I closed the door, Sandy gave me a hug. Davy, I've been a fool and I'm so sorry. I love you and I want us to be together again. I want to be your wife again. Catherine Morgan grew up always trying to be a good girl, someone her parents would be proud to call their daughter. That's why when her friends in high school told her about an actress named Kathy Morgan, she immediately forbade anyone to call her Kathy, and from that day forward went by the name Kate. The hardest part was convincing her father until she finally broke down and told him why. They both blushed, and her dad never called her Katie again. And Kate had been a good girl. Until last night, she'd only had 2 men in her life. The first was her boyfriend from high school. They'd both lost their virginity the night of the prom. Instead of going to an all-night party, Jeffrey had booked a hotel room in town, and they had spent a nice night awkwardly losing their cherries. The second man was a guy she'd dated for 3 years in college. Their lovemaking had been enjoyable, but the sex made her wonder what all the fuss was about. It was a combination of factors. It was obvious to Kate now that Howard was shallow, at least compared to Jeffrey or Davy, and Howard had never tried to kiss her down there like Davy had last night. Her first night with Davy had surpassed anything that had happened in 3 years with Howard. When Kate left Davy's house in the morning, she was already planning their wedding. She was glad they had waited to have sex until she realized she was absolutely in love with Davy and was sure he had the same feelings for her. Everything that had happened last night had exceeded her expectations. She had planned to have sex with Davy when she got back from this latest business trip. It made the trip seem slow as molasses. What she hadn't expected was to enjoy sex so much, spending an hour with him in the bathtub naked, sleeping next to him, naked bodies pressed against each other. It was all so exciting for a girl who had kept her sensuality in reserve all her life. Kate entered her apartment and threw a week's supply of work clothes on the bed. She jogged around the apartment, gathering sports gear and enough casual clothes for the next 2 days. Grabbing her pajamas, she stopped, looked at them in her hand, and smiled as she tossed them back into the drawer. This isn't necessary, she thought to herself. Kate stopped long enough to water the houseplants in a hurry, and then carried the suitcase to her car and drove to Davy's house, trying her best to obey the speed limit and not run any red lights. As she turned onto Davy's street, she was brought out of her euphoric state by a sight that nearly crushed her. A red Honda with Tennessee license plates was parked in the driveway. Kate didn't stop. She continued driving, but now with tears instead of a smile on her face. As Kate drove past Davy's house, Davy and Sandy were inside discussing all the things that should have been said before their divorce. Davy was finishing his story. I looked at Sandy. She was still beautiful, even with one black eye. "Tell me why, Sandy. Tell me why you left me for a guy who ends up beating you up." "I was so mad at you after you showed me that video of Alice. It doesn't make any sense now, but at the time I blamed you for bringing it to my attention. It was another thing that broke my heart over my little sister. I always thought that maybe I hadn't done enough to help her. I projected my inability to save her onto you. At the same time, Benny started calling me just to talk. When I told him about the video, he assumed you were spending your free time watching movies instead of looking for a job in Memphis. Benny said a lot of things that shook my confidence in our relationship. He told me that it was common knowledge that the reason you were stabbed by that gang member was because you were sleeping with his lady. I let Sandy ramble on for a while, thinking about how this whole nightmare reminded me of some B-movie I saw on TV late one night. Then I said my word. "Stay here, I want to show you something." I went to my office and selected 2 files. "Sandy, first, here is a printout of the email that Jason Taylor sent me. You can read exactly what he notified me about the video. I kept a copy of his email in case I was ever suspected of viewing something forbidden. Notice how Jason refers to the old friend who gave him the website address. When I ran into Jason last year, he gave me the name of his friend. It was Benjamin Johnston." Sandy sat there with her mouth open. I didn't stop. "Here's the report from the private investigator I hired after I talked to Jason. Something doesn't add up about the biker who tried to stab me that night. Go ahead and read the statement he got from one of the gang that was in the bar that night. I, Samuel Archer, a private investigator hired by David Newman, met with Daniel Bailey, a member of the Diablos motorcycle gang based in Joliet. Mr. Bailey, for a fee of $500, provided the following statement. Although he was adamant that he would never repeat this statement to law enforcement or under oath. Mr. Bailey confirmed that Benjamin Johnston paid him and his associates $7,500 to kill David Newman. The gang made the mistake of assigning this task to one Joseph Burns as part of his initiation into gang membership. The plan was simple. Start a fight at one of the clubs where Mr. Newman's band was performing, and Mr. Burns would take advantage of the chaos to kill Mr. Newman with a knife. Mr. Burns fails because of the quick reaction of Kevin Morris, the bass player. Sandy finished reading and looked at me again with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. The one thing I never found out was why your boyfriend never made a second attempt." Sandy replied, "Well, it was around the time Benny started dating that hip-hop diva. He probably forgot about me for a while, at least until she dumped him when he was traded to the Titans." "And that's when he started messing with you again?" "Yes, and I was stupid enough to take his calls because he said he needed a friend to talk to. He used my friendship to undermine our marriage, and I let him do it. Can you ever forgive me? Can I please come home? I love you, Davy. I was looking at one of the most beautiful women I'd ever known, a woman I loved with all my heart, a woman who needed a friend, my forgiveness and my love now more than she ever had in her life. My heart and soul begged me to be that friend, that lover, and that man big enough to forgive her lapse in judgment when she broke our vows and left me for another man. And damn it, she must have undone those top 2 buttons on her sundress while I was in my office. Those 2 perfect breasts were half exposed and teased me. I put my arm around her shoulders and pulled her to me. "I forgive you, Sandy." I kissed her forehead. Sandy looked at me with all the hope in the world in those beautiful blue eyes. "I forgive you and wish you all the best for the future. But maybe someday you will realize that love is not a letter word you use to get your way. I'm not saying this to offend you, but I am truly in love with a wonderful woman that I plan to marry, and we will start a family together. She's been my rock in this stupid world. She brought me back from the brink. I'm not going to betray her trust because you need me now. I don't want you to get hurt, so please don't go back to Benjamin. Take some time, like I did, to get your bearings and heal, physically, mentally, and spiritually. I wish you all the best." Sandy couldn't take it anymore. She lay on the couch, shivering and sobbing until I decided to call her parents. They came over. I explained that I accepted her apology, forgave her for leaving me for a jerk, but refused to take her back. Thankfully, her parents understood. They enveloped her in a hug and took her to their home. After Sandy left with her parents, I looked at my watch. It was past 3 in the afternoon. Kate should have been here hours ago. I dialed Kate's number and waited for her to answer. It was the longest 15 seconds of my life. Epilogue. When Kate answered the phone, she seemed distant. I asked her if I could pick her up. I needed to go to the mall, and I was hoping she could come with me. I needed her opinion before buying a gift for a special friend. Kate seemed reluctant, but agreed. I drove to her house. She came out, got in my car, and we were at the mall 20 minutes before it closed. I took her into a jewelry store, and she looked embarrassed. I knelt down on my knees. "Please pick out your ring and marry me." Kate dropped to her knees and hugged me. She kissed me like I had never been kissed before. It was another 5 minutes before we rose from our knees. She chose a very simple design with a half-carat diamond, of course. I told the saleswoman to put a full carat in the setting, and I'd pick it up tomorrow. I toured with the John Reginald Band for 2 months during our engagement. That tour got me out of the traveling habit, and no, I didn't sleep with any groupies. But the music bug stayed with me. Shortly after our wedding, Katie and I moved to Austin, where I work full-time in systems development. This allows me enough flexibility to spend a few hours a month as a session guitarist and violinist. Oh, and enough time to be a proud and caring dad to the 3 kids Katie and I are lucky enough to have. Yes, you read that right. At the wedding, her father came up to her and asked, "Now that your last name is Newman, is it okay if I call my little girl Katie again?" The sweetest woman I know cried when she told her dad it was okay. All these years later, I still catch myself singing that silly Dean Martin tune. How lucky can one guy be? I kissed her and she kissed me. As a guy once said, isn't that a kick in the head?